So we left off last time looking at the ministry Jesus had in Galilee. And we finished with this text that he has in 9 of Jesus setting his face to Jerusalem. And now we move into what is called this travel narrative. So from chapter 9 all the way down to 19 in Luke, it is this consistent motif that Jesus has his face set toward Jerusalem, but is not yet there. He actually arrives in chapter 19. Scholars debate about what this actually means, if we should be interpreting all of these in light of Jerusalem, or if it's just he's traveling, he's an itinerant preacher, and this is what they do. It's unclear. But it's in this section that we get a lot of the much more popular and famous and cultural stories. I was looking through these and thinking oh, I have a kid's book about most of these for my kids. There are kids' songs about these things. And I think that's because these stories are very vivid. They're imaginative. They're designed to stick with you. There's a whole branch of scholarship that looks at Jesus' pedagogy, the way that Jesus teaches, and argues that the way that Jesus teaches is pretty effective for retention. He teaches in a way that relates his meaning to real world visual images so that people can remember them much more easily. They're easier to remember and they're easier to be repeated. Jesus teaches in such a way to make it easier for his disciples to repeat his teachings to other people, right? That seems like part of the reason Jesus is doing what he's doing, or teaching the way that he's teaching, or giving us these vivid images. Okay, go ahead. So let's start with this Good Samaritan in Luke 10, which I know for all of these, we are, I would argue, probably too familiar with the story to where we assume we know exactly what it means. And so we don't really get into it very much because, oh, it's the Good Samaritan. I know what that means. I've heard that since I was 3. And so it doesn't really matter. I know what it means. I could skip over it. Or I don't need to think more critically about it because I know what it means. One thing that scholars will do now is, if you remember from the beginning of class, we talked about a lot of these texts operating on 2 levels of Jesus talking to the crowds, but also Luke talking to his audience. Scholars will look at some of these texts, some of these parables, and say, obviously the parable has meaning, but maybe Luke is trying to force a different meaning on it by giving us context around the parable. Right? What are the chances that Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan only one time? Probably slim, right? These are effective and creative stories that teach certain ethics and morals and religious truths. It's unlikely that he just had this one context where he told this story. But Luke is giving us a specific context in order to shape the way that we interpret the text. Some scholars will point to that and say, well, we need to split that back out and see if the text itself, the parable itself, means something apart from the fluff that Luke is giving us. I don't know if that's an effective way to read it, because we don't have any versions of the parable that exist apart from the context that Luke gives us, right? It's not like Matthew is giving us a competing context and we have to choose. We don't have this story anywhere else. Good? So what's the context here? A lawyer gets up and is asking him, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, well, what's in the law? What's the rule? And so he tells him, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. This is a very Jewish answer. And I think we tend to read it as very Christian. Right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul and strength. But it's a very Jewish answer. This is the right answer for a Jew at this time, right? And so Jesus just says, yes, you're right. If you do this, you'll live. But then it gives motive to this lawyer wanting to justify himself, as if I felt like this before. I wonder if you all have. You ask a question and the professor kind of like writes it off as a dumb question, like gives you an answer, but it's also like, why did you ask that question? And then you feel like, well, no, there was a reason I wanted to ask the question, and I'm not an idiot, I promise. And so I'm going to ask a follow-up question to prove that I'm not as stupid as I feel right now. Anybody feel this before? Hopefully not in this class. It seems like that's what he's doing, is trying to justify the fact that he just asked a question. He says, "Who is my neighbor?" And so Jesus tells the story. We talked on Tuesday about the classifications of Israelites, how they fall into the categories of priest, which is descendants of Aaron, Levites, which is all the other descendants of Levi that aren't Aaron, and Israelites, right? The normal, common Jew that's not a Levite, somebody from the other 11 tribes, right? Jesus is telling this story, and in his categorization, he switches it up, and so it is a priest and a Levite and a Samaritan. Maybe the person who's going to come and help you is somebody you don't like, right? Maybe you need to be humble enough to accept help from someone who you have previously been unkind to. Maybe it's a way that you need to check your own prejudices, because you won't, in your mind, you don't even want to accept help from someone like this, right? Jesus is really calling into question these sorts of ideas. A lot of us, I think, I'm curious if you all have heard this. The guy falls upon a band of robbers. They beat him up, leave him half dead. A priest is going down the road and passed on the other side. A Levite also came and passed on the other side. Why did they pass on the other side? Have you all heard, like, I don't know a better word for it, excuses for them? Yeah, I'm always curious about these sorts of stories. There's dozens of these like kid versions of these stories. And most of the time, in order to explain this to a child, they do give motive. And they're sometimes they're scared. Oh, maybe the robbers are still here and it's not safe for me to be here. Sometimes it's really common for the Levite, I'm too busy, can't stop, got to get to work, or whatever it is. I think in churches, I normally hear people preach on this and say that the priest or the Levite would be ritually impure if they touched a dead body. Have you all heard this? If you look at your brand new JANT, it's not true. Like, it's just not part of the issue. I mean, it is technically true that you are ritually impure if you touch a dead body, but you are ethically impure. You commit a moral transgression if you leave a dead body out to rot, which is worse. Second, everyone is ritually impure. That's why they have ritual purification processes at the temple. You go to the temple and you are ritually impure, so you cleanse yourself so that you become more ritually pure. And third, the priest and the Levite are both going down, which means they're leaving Jerusalem, which means they're not like on their way to the temple to make sacrifice. They're leaving Jerusalem. And so it doesn't matter about their ritual purity. No one is going to check them on it. The ethical obligation is to help someone in need, or to bury a dead body, even if it's a foreigner or even if it's a poor person who can't afford it. You're supposed to bury a dead body. The critique here is that the priests and the Levites are not following Torah properly. I think a lot of the preaching that I hear implies that something is wrong with Torah, that they're adhering to Torah too closely and they're not helping people. And that's not what Jesus is really saying. If they were actually adhering to Torah, they would have helped. They would have stopped. And to contrast this and show them just how far away from proper Torah adherence they are, who is it that comes along and properly fulfills Torah? It's the Samaritan. These sort of stories exist. I don't know if they exist prior to Jesus. This is certainly a very common trope within rabbinic Judaism 3 or 4 centuries later, where they do tell these stories, and it's a priest and a Levite and a Jew, and the priest and Levite do not uphold Torah, and the Jew does. They're very common. It's hard in the history and the scholarship to see if they designed those stories because of this Good Samaritan story, or if those stories already exist at Jesus' time and he's flipping the script. It's hard to tell. But the point here is the Samaritan goes out of his way to do something, even when in all other calculations, he is not a proper Torah observing person. Good on this? At the end of 10, we get to Mary and Martha. We are very familiar with them. We've heard them a lot before. Do not be tempted to assume that you know who Mary is. Okay? I think we have talked about this in other classes, but there are several women running around in the early Christian groups that are named Mary. Why? Why would there be so many women named Mary? Because of Miriam. Yes. Because, like, the best Jewish woman ever is named Mary. And so there are a lot of people that are just named after her. That's normal naming convention. Don't think that Mary and Martha is Mary Magdalene, right? Mary Magdalene probably means that she's from a city called Magdala. Mary and Martha are from Bethany, which is a different city. I'm sure we've talked about this in other classes. We tend to conflate all of the women together when we shouldn't. So remember, we just got introduced to Mary Magdalene on Tuesday, where it says that she had demons driven out of her, and that she, loves the Lord or whatever. We're also introduced to a woman who comes in and anoints Jesus' feet and weeps over him, and it says that because she's forgiven much, she loves much. We tend to conflate all of those women together. So we have like the woman who loved much. We have the Magdalene, and we have Mary, the sister of Martha. We tend to conflate all of these women together into one person, and we call her Mary. We invent the idea that she's a prostitute, that she has some sort of sexual sin, and that Jesus forgives her and loves her much, and this is who she is. The problem with this is that it's just destroying all of these different women that we have in the text and giving us the story of one woman who just so happens to be a whore. And then the other woman in the text, the other woman in the gospel who's viewed positively is Jesus's mother, Mary. So you have Mary, you have two different Marys at this point. You have Mary over here, who's a whore. I'm not going to write that on the text. And then Mary over here, who is both a virgin and a mother. And over the course of history, reading the text this way, we result in there are only two kinds of women. We classify them either as whores or as virginal mothers, right? And this is obviously, you guys are laughing, hugely problematic, right? Because this is an impossible standard for obvious reasons. I think most people later would say, well, you choose. You're either a virgin or you get married and have children. But that's not what the text gives us. The text gives us a virginal mother, which is impossible. The reason I point this out is because there are a number of women in the text. And if we conflate them down to this like simple reduction, it harms our reading of the text, which I think is important to us, but it also harms like the people who are hearing you read the text, right? Like the women in your congregation who are hearing these stories where they're trying to find someone in the text to relate to, and these two women are unrelatable, right? The amount of sin that Mary has, where 7 demons had to be driven out of her to get her to stop prostituting herself. Nobody really relates to that level of depravity, right? The text doesn't even tell us that. We've invented a new level of sexual depravity to ascribe to her, right? And then Mary has this new level of like ascetic purity that we can't ascribe to that either. And so women in the audience are left with like nobody to look up to, nobody to like latch onto as a representative of what a Christian female, Christian femininity, Christian womanhood should look like. You all on board with this? Understand the problem? Go ahead, Julie. Yeah, and I think Luke tries to separate them. And Luke is probably assuming that all of his audience knows that there's a bunch of Marys running around, right? They're probably early enough that they know some of these women or that they've heard stories from some of these women, right? Maybe they actually know the name of the woman who's anointing Jesus' feet, right? It's ironic. I don't think it's in Luke. I think it's in a different gospel where it says, Jesus says, because of this act, she is going to be remembered forever. You guys know what I'm talking about? Because of like the kindness that she showed me, she's going to be remembered forever. But the text doesn't give us her name. So like, how is she remembered forever? We know what she did, but we don't know who she is. You'd think if we wanted to remember her forever, they would have told us her name. Maybe she, disappeared anonymously and the gospel authors couldn't figure out her name. We don't really know. The point here is Mary and Martha are going to be figures that we're going to keep looking at, especially when we get to John, because John is going to tell us that they have a brother named Lazarus. Now, when we hear Mary and Martha in one text and then Mary and Martha and Lazarus in another, I do assume those are the same people. I assume that the chances of Mary and Martha, two sisters named that way, who are all disciples of Jesus, I don't think that there are two sets of sisters with these naming conventions, right? I think it's the same people. And Lazarus is going to pop up. We'll go ahead and skip down to 16. John is going to tell us about Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Now, what happens in that story in John 11? He cries and then undoes the reason for the crying, resurrects him, right? The reason I bring this up, I imagine, and I haven't looked at this, the Fourth Synoptic Gospel book at all. I imagine that this is part of the reason that he's arguing that there's connections between John and the Synoptics. Luke also tells us a story about a man named Lazarus who dies, and there are implications, there are suggestions that he should come back from the dead. So Luke is introducing us to these sisters named Mary and Martha, and also to a dead man named Lazarus who might or might not have come back from the dead. And John tells us a story about Mary and Martha, whose brother died and did come back from the dead. Maybe there's a connection here. Matthew and Mark don't tell us anything about Mary and Martha, and they don't tell us anything about Lazarus. So maybe John is reading this in Luke and giving us the full story. Okay, so let's just skip ahead a little to this Luke 16, and then we'll pull back. I love this story. It's fascinating. There was a rich man. Actually, where is it? It's a different rich man. This is 16:19. A rich man dressed in purple. This is like royal colors, right? And fine linens, who feasted every day. And at his gate, right outside, there was a poor man named Lazarus. Immediately, you should know who the bad guy is, because the rich man is feasting every day while there's someone starving outside his gate. This is just like the Good Samaritan. You should be taking care of the people around you who are starving. They both die. The poor man dies, Lazarus, and is carried away with angels to be with Abraham. We don't know what this means, right? Who knows? The rich man dies and is buried. And in hell, in Hades, he's being tormented, and looks up and sees Lazarus at Abraham's bosom, at Abraham's side, reclining next to him in comfort. The rich man calls out, Father Abraham. So he's a Jew, right? He identifies himself Jewishly, connecting himself ethnically to Abraham. Have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue. He still, even in death, does not consider Lazarus worthy of talking to him. He doesn't ask Lazarus to help him. He asks Abraham to command that filthy slave, servant, despicable, gross person Lazarus to do something for him. Right? He also does not ask to get out of the torment. So Abraham says, no, there's this great chasm between us so that we can't cross from one side to another. Okay. Lazarus can't go over and give you any water. So then he says, send Lazarus to my father's house. Again, commanding Abraham to command Lazarus to do something. I have 5 brothers. He may warn them so that they won't come to this place of torment. And Abraham says, no, they have Moses and the prophets. If they listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't end up where you are. And so the man says, no, if someone goes to them from the dead, they'll repent. And essentially he said, no, they won't be convinced, even if they see someone rise from the dead. If they've already rejected Moses and the prophets, resurrection won't prove anything to them. You can see the rhetoric of this story where 1, Jesus is going to rise from the dead and it's still not going to convince people. But 2, we know in John, there's a man named Lazarus who rises from the dead. And instead of that being convincing to people that Jesus is the Messiah, what's the response in John 11? It's the resurrection of Lazarus that gets the Jewish leaders to conspire to kill Jesus. In the synoptics, it's the overturning of tables. He comes in the triumphal entry. He overturns the tables, the cleansing of the temple. And then because of that, the leaders say, we got to kill this guy. In John, it's because he raises Lazarus from the dead. So instead of seeing the resurrection of Lazarus as pointing to the proof of who Jesus is, they take it in exactly the opposite direction. You can see why this is an appealing connection, reading this story here in connection with Mary and Martha and the death of Lazarus in John 11. Good on this point? A few more things. I really like this story a lot. It is super weird. Is this a parable? The text doesn't say Jesus taught them this parable, okay? Every parable that Jesus ever teaches in the synoptics does not identify the name of any character. It's always an unnamed person. A man who had 2 sons, a woman who lost a coin, a seed that's buried in the ground, etc., etc. This is the only story, if it is a parable, this is the only parable that gives someone a name, and the name is Lazarus. What are the chances, right? So some people read this to say, it's not a parable. Jesus is telling a true story of what Lazarus experienced during his quote-unquote death for those 4 days. Other people read it to say, no, that's the point of the parable, is that in death, you're robbed of your identity, and the only type of people who actually have an identity in death are those who are properly following Torah, properly obeying God, like Lazarus. Lazarus continues to be a unique individual person with an identity because he is properly following Torah. Does this make sense? Good. One more thing. The rich man never asks to get out. The first thing that he does is actually ask that somebody else come in, right? I'm uncomfortable. Send Lazarus to hell to make me a little less uncomfortable. Imagine, right? I think we talked about this in probably our theology class a while back. I don't remember which scholar or theologian or writer talked about it, but the idea of if someone is in hell for 1,000 years and is offered a chance out, they still won't take it. Right? Because it's not the discomfort of hell that has put them there. It is the rejection of Christ. And nothing in hell makes them want to accept Christ. Right? This is kind of proof of that idea. This guy can look across and see Lazarus and Abraham in comfort and does not ask to get out. I also find this, my last thought on this, when we talk about missions, we talk a lot about the Great Commission. Jesus commands us to go and spread the gospel to other people, right? So we kind of have this call from above of God is up here and telling us through the Great Commission to go and do missions, right? We also have, say this is us down here, and this is the command coming from God. We also have people near us that are asking us to do this. So I think of Cornelius in Acts. Cornelius is asking from the side, from our level, please come and preach the gospel to us so that we may accept it, right? We normally hear about these sort of things preached when we preach on missions. There's this command from God, and there's also this request from people around us. Please come and preach the message to us. This story in Luke 16, I think, is also showing us a call from below, right? That you have the rich man down here. I'm not even going to be able to draw fire. Let's see. Is this fire or is this like a pot plant? I don't know. He is down here. Sorry. And he from below is calling us to preach the gospel to his relatives so that they don't end up down here. I find this to be very compelling. If you know anyone who's outside of the gospel, there is a command from God to preach the gospel to them. They don't know it, but they want you to preach the gospel to them. And anyone who loves them also wants you to preach the gospel to them. Right? Family members that they have lost outside of the gospel who are now suffering, they are begging for you to go and do this thing. Good on this? Any questions about the rich man and Lazarus? Okay. Let's jump back. Luke 11 and 12 has more of the Sermon on the Mount. It's got a different version of the Lord's Prayer. And different teachings and sayings, but they are very spread out. So, like we talked about on Tuesday, you can go through and look at the way Luke tells the Sermon on the Mount and the way that Matthew tells it, and compare and contrast to see the difference of things that they're focused on. But we can keep moving forward. I want to spend some time talking about what we call the prodigal son, right? There's a push lately to stop calling it that. For several reasons. One, it's put in the context of these other stories. So Jesus tells 3 stories in a row. There's 100 sheep and they lose 1. There's 10 coins and they lose 1. There's 2 sons and they lose 1. So maybe the point is not really calling him prodigal. And because of this, there's an increased push now to read the parables in light of each other. We tend to just read the prodigal son by itself. And we focus on like the son, quote unquote, repenting and coming back, and the father running out to him and how great that must be. God is just sitting on the porch waiting for you to come back and he'll run out and hug you. And kind of, I think now, criticism against the older brother for like being mean to his brother or whatever. If you read the text in light of each other, you might get a different opinion of what's actually going on. In the parable of the lost sheep, who is the main character? It's the shepherd. It's not the one sheep that ran away. It's the shepherd who does what he can to get the sheep back, right? In the 10 coins, the woman loses a coin and she calls her friends and like sweeps out the floor and lights the lamp and whatever to find the coin. Who's the main character? The woman, not the coin. So then the question is, in the parable of the 2 sons, who's the main character? Is it really about the son who's lost? Or, given what these other stories are about, is it really about the father? So some people will call this like the parable of the man who had 2 sons. Because it's about him losing his sons. There's a lot of ways to read this text. I think the most common one throughout church history is to read the older brother as the Jews and the younger brother as the Gentiles. That the older brother thinks that he deserves his position because of his work, and the younger brother, although he goes off and does sin, he comes back and repents, and he's loved by the Father. You can see why this would be appealing, but also, I don't think this is what the text is saying, right? I don't know that this is the case. Think about the younger brother. When he comes back, he's not really repenting and saying, I'm sorry for what I did. This is a calculated move. He's starving, and he's thinking, even if I were a servant, I would be getting more food from my father. That does not reflect his repentance. That reflects the goodness of the father. The father is taking care of even the slaves who work for him and taking care of them well and providing housing and food for them. Right? there's a lot of debate about what's actually going on with, like, I think you've all probably heard it preached. The younger son is coming and saying, "Give me my inheritance," which essentially is saying, like, you're better off dead. Like, I hate you so much, and you're more valuable to me dead than alive. So just give me your money as if you were dead. I've heard that. I don't know how true that is. They also argue when the father accepts the son back, he is actually taking money from the older son. Because when the son leaves with the money, now it is true that everything the father has will go to the older son, right? He doesn't have to cut part of the will for the younger son because he's already gotten his inheritance. And so when he re-accepts the son, maybe he is cutting some of the money away from the older brother because he's giving him a new inheritance. I also don't know the legality of that. There's a lot of debate about whether that's actually what would happen or not. It's unclear. The older brother also seems to be problematic because when his brother comes back, he doesn't say, "My brother has come back." What does he say? "This son of yours has come back." He does not have a relationship with the brother. He might still be mad at him because you left our dad high and dry and like cussed him out and took his car and left. And I stayed here to pick up the pieces. And I have been a loving, doting son to take care of our father. And you have been off squandering your money on God knows what, right? You could see like the modern day, Hallmark movie that this is. But the other problem with that interpretation, the father seems not to care about the older son. The father is so excited about the younger son returning, he throws a party and doesn't tell the older brother. The older brother finds out about it because he comes home and there's a party. So the whole story, the more you read it, it becomes more and more problematic. I don't like the idea of reading the story where the father is God and the sons represent the Jews and the Gentiles, because God doesn't come out looking very good in the story, right? He loves one son so much that it drives him away, and he ignores another son so much that he feels disconnected. It doesn't seem great. I also can't really offer you a better reading of the text that I like better, right? Maybe you all can, but I would strongly discourage the idea that one of them is the Jew and one of them is the Gentile. That's kind of hugely problematic. If you think about like ancient Judaism, which brother would the Jews want to relate to historically? Think of like fathers who have two male sons. Which one is always the good guy? Not for the Jews. It's almost always the younger brother. It's always Abel and not Cain, Jacob and not Esau, Isaac and not Ishmael. Right? And so the Jews reading this in the first century, hearing this, would be offended because they would want to relate to the older brother who's doing the right thing, but they think they're supposed to relate to the younger brother who's living in sin. So I don't think the connection would work to say that the younger brother is the Gentiles, because any first century Jew hearing this would say, no, the Jews are always the younger brother. We're descended from younger brothers having younger brothers, right? That's our whole thing. And so this connection of reading onto it like salvation history, I don't think is the point of the story. I think it is much more about, I think the story gives us some context of like heaven rejoicing when someone repents or something. Maybe we're supposed to read the story in light of that, but maybe we're just supposed to read it in light of sheep returning to the fold, coins returning to the purse, and sons returning to their father. And that is the proper state of things. Good on this? Okay. We are almost out of time. Let's look at the Pharisee and tax collector in 18. And I just have one thought on this. We've all heard this story also, the Pharisee and the tax collector. Right? The Pharisee says, "I thank you that I do these good righteous deeds." And I thank you that I'm not like this tax collector. And the tax collector just says, have mercy on me, a sinner. We tend to read it where it says, I tell you that one of them walked away justified instead of the other, right? I think if you read your text, that's what it says. AJ, my New Testament professor here, used to say that might not be the best translation. You could also translate the word to say one of them walked away justified alongside the other one, that they were both justified, because it doesn't seem like the Pharisee is doing anything to make himself unjustified. There's also this idea in first century Judaism where your righteousness can actually cover the sins of another person. So maybe you could read this parable and think in terms of the Pharisee is so righteous that he's actually unknowingly giving some righteousness to the tax collector. The tax collector is being humble, and the Pharisee is so righteous that his righteousness overflows to the humble man next to him. Maybe. I think what we have tended to do is read this and think, oh, the tax collector is great and the Pharisee's not. But what that does rhetorically for us is puts you in the position where you read the story and you think, thank you, God, that I'm not like this Pharisee. Right? And that is the rhetorical power of the story. You are supposed to not like the Pharisee, but then you're immediately supposed to feel convicted for not liking the Pharisee. Does this make sense? Okay, one more thing I want to cover before we leave. Luke gives us a very similar passion narrative, so I kind of skimmed through it to see if there were, highlighted things that were different. Most of the passion itself is very similar. There are a few things that are different. Herod is present, right? Pilate sends Jesus to Herod to be tried. Herod doesn't really care, sends him back to Pilate. That's new. Matthew doesn't tell us that. Luke also tells us this bit about one of the criminals being hung next to Jesus says like, hey, you shouldn't be so mean to Jesus. He's a good guy. And, remember me when you go into your glory. And Jesus looks at him and says, tonight, you and me will be in paradise together. Paradise actually comes from I think it's Aramaic word for garden. Like that's how paradise arrives in our language. It probably means garden. It probably is Jesus telling him, you and I will be in Eden tonight. This, for me, throws a wrench into the idea of like Jesus died and descended into hell for 3 days while he was dead and preached the gospel to people in hell. I don't really like that. Jesus is telling this guy, you and I will be in heaven tonight. I don't know. What I do want to pick up on is in Luke, we do have a lot of different resurrection stories. One of them being one of my favorites that starts in 24:13. There are two disciples on the road to Emmaus. And essentially they're walking along and they're very sad. It's like a 7-mile walk from Jerusalem to Emmaus. And Jesus comes along and starts talking to them. Crazy. They don't know that it's him. More crazy. They start saying, hey, all of these terrible things happen and we're super sad about it. And now Jesus' body is missing and we don't know what to do. Jesus, starting with the Old Testament, preaches to them for the walk and teaches them about, here's all the places in the Old Testament that told us the Messiah had to die for us to be saved. And then they still don't know that it's him until they get to town and they invite Jesus to eat, and he prays and breaks bread and they eat it. And it's only upon eating with Jesus that their eyes are opened and they realize that it's him. And the second they realize it's him, he's gone. It's a great story. They have this line about, they say, didn't our hearts burn within us while he was preaching, right? Something in them knew that it was him, even though they couldn't put a finger on it. There's two things I really like about this. One, he's preaching through the Old Testament about the proofs of his death and resurrection being necessary. And two, it is the connection with Christ that reveals the scriptures to them, right? It says the same thing way later, where in verse 45, this is right at the end, where he's with all the disciples, and it says that Jesus opened their minds to understand the scriptures. Understanding scripture apart from regeneration from the Spirit is impossible. right? I think I know this in my own testimony of like trying to read the Bible and not being able to, it just not making any sense. But I think it's true, outside of my own like personal life, um, that any effort to read and understand the Bible has to come from a position of regeneration. That it's God who will open your mind to actually understand the scriptures. I like that. There's a great sermon from Tim Keller on this passage. When I read this passage, I hear it in Tim Keller's voice because I listened to this sermon enough times that hearing him read the passage is kind of just like imprinted in my brain. I'll see if I can find the sermon and send it to you guys. But it is a great message about this passage of these two disciples on the road to Emmaus and having Christ revealed to them in this way. I know we're out of time though. Does anybody have any questions before we leave?